The 14th of December, 1880, Carlisle, Pennsylvania. 2 children died at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School that day. Their names were Maud Little Girl and Ernest Knoxoff. Maud was a Rosebud Sioux girl. The school newspaper later described her as a bright, impulsive, warm-hearted girl, much loved by her schoolmates. Ernest was a Rosebud Sioux boy. The newspaper called him a bright, studious, ambitious boy, standing first in his class, and of so tractable a disposition as to be no trouble to his teachers. Both died on the same day. Both were buried in the school cemetery. Their bodies were never sent home. Their families 1,600 miles away in South Dakota were not informed for weeks. When the news finally reached the Rosebud Reservation, 2 fathers learned on the same day that their children had died. Swift Bear lost his daughter Maud. White Thunder lost his son Ernest. The school records note, the deaths of the relatives of Swift, Bear, and White Thunder on the same day were of particular concern back home at the Rosebud Agency. Particular concern. That's how the government described 2 fathers losing their children on the same day, 1,600 miles from home, buried in unmarked graves. Maud Little Girl and Ernest Knoxoff were 10 years old. They'd been at Carlisle for 2 months. They are buried together in the Carlisle Indian School Cemetery, along with 184 other Native American children, from 42 different tribes, aged 3 to 25. Every single one of them died far from home, far from their families, far from their people. But Carlisle was just one school. Between 1,860 and 1978, 118 years, the United States government operated 367 Indian boarding schools across 29 states. In Canada, 139 residential schools operated from 1883 to 1997, 114 years. Combined, over 500 schools in 2 countries for more than a century. The goal, stated explicitly by the founder of the Carlisle School, Richard Henry Pratt, in 1892, kill the Indian in him and save the man. Here's what that meant in practice. Children as young as 4 years old were taken from their families, sometimes forcibly. Sometimes parents were told, "Give us your children, or we'll withhold your rations. Your family will starve." The children were transported hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles away, to schools in unfamiliar states. They were forbidden to speak their native languages. If they did, they were beaten, mouths washed with lye soap, locked in closets, starved. They were forced to cut their hair. In many native cultures, cutting hair was done only in mourning. Cutting a child's hair was cutting their identity. They were given English names, often random names from lists on walls, names that meant nothing to them. They were dressed in military-style uniforms, boys in stiff collars and suspenders, girls in identical dresses. They were taught that their culture was savage, their religion was evil, their families were inferior, and thousands of them died. How many? We still don't know the full number. In the United States, official records document at least 500 deaths at federal boarding schools. Historians estimate the true number could be 6,000 to 25,000. In Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission documented 4,120 confirmed deaths. The commission chairman estimated the true number could be 6,000 to 25,000. Combined, potentially, 50,000 children died in these schools. They died of tuberculosis, measles, pneumonia, influenza, smallpox. They died because schools were overcrowded, underfunded, unsanitary. They died because when they got sick, schools sent them home to die, to keep death counts low. They died because many schools had no doctors, no nurses, no medical care. They died of malnutrition because schools fed them barely enough to survive. They died of abuse, beaten so severely they never recovered. They died by suicide, children as young as 8 or 9, so desperate to escape that they took their own lives. And they died of sadness, separated from everyone they loved, forbidden to be who they were. Some children simply gave up. And when they died, their bodies were buried in unmarked graves on school grounds. Every school had its own cemetery. Families were often not informed. Bodies were not returned. The graves were forgotten, lost, erased, until 2021, the 27th of May, 2021. Kamloops Indian Residential School, British Columbia, Canada. Ground-penetrating radar detected 215 unmarked graves on the former school grounds. All children. The news made international headlines, and it sparked a reckoning. Since 2021, over 1,300 unmarked graves have been found at former Canadian residential schools. In the United States, investigations have identified at least 53 burial sites at boarding schools. Archaeologists expect the number to grow significantly as more schools are searched. This is not ancient history. The last Canadian residential school closed in 1997. The last American Indian boarding school closed in 1978. People alive today attended these schools, survived these schools, lost siblings, parents, grandparents to these schools. The trauma continues through generations. This is the story of what happened to Native American and First Nations children in residential schools. Not legends, not myths, not exaggerations. Documented facts, government records, survivor testimonies, burial sites discovered with modern technology. This is the story of Maud Little Girl and Ernest Knoxoff, who died together on the 14th of December 1880, and the story of Luther Standing Bear, who survived Carlisle and later wrote about watching his friends die, and the story of Sophia Tetoff, aged 12, from Alaska, who died of tuberculosis in 1906, thousands of miles from home, and the stories of thousands of children whose names we don't even know, buried in graves marked only unknown. This is the story of kill the Indian, save the man. This is the story of what that really meant. The system begins. 1860 to 1879, 613, 1,550 words. Narrator. To understand how this happened, we need to go back to the 1860s. The context. The United States had just fought a civil war. Slavery had been abolished. The country was expanding westward, and Native Americans stood in the way. For decades, the U.S. government had tried to solve what they called the Indian problem through war. The result, massacres, forced relocations, the Trail of Tears, broken treaties, genocide. But war was expensive, and native peoples kept resisting. So the government decided on a new strategy, cultural genocide instead of physical genocide. If you can't kill the people, kill the culture. Take the children, remake them into white Americans. The philosophy came from what was called the Friends of the Indian movement, well-meaning white reformers who genuinely believed they were helping. They looked at native peoples and saw, these people are vanishing. Their only hope for survival is to become like us. We must civilize them before it's too late. It was racism disguised as charity. And it was supported by the U.S. government, Christian churches, and most of white American society. 1,860. The first Indian boarding schools begin operating, initially run by Christian missionaries. 1,879. The U.S. government opens the first federal off-reservation boarding school, Carlisle Indian Industrial School, in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. The founder, Captain Richard Henry Pratt. Who was Richard Henry Pratt? He was a U.S. Army officer. In the 1870s, he'd been in charge of Native American prisoners of war held at Fort Marion in Florida. While guarding these prisoners, Pratt developed a theory. Native Americans weren't inherently inferior. They just needed to be educated in white ways. He believed he could transform native people into white people culturally, and he believed the best way to do this was with children. Take them young, before their culture was too deeply rooted. Separate them from their families and tribes. Immerse them completely in white American culture. In 1892, he gave a speech explaining his philosophy. A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead Indian. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. That was the official motto of the system. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. Pratt chose Carlisle, Pennsylvania for his school because it was far from any native reservation, making it nearly impossible for children to run away home. It was close to Washington, D.C., so government officials could easily visit and see his successes. It had existing buildings, an old army barracks that could be converted. In 1879, Pratt traveled to the Rosebud and Pine Ridge reservations in South Dakota to recruit students. He met with native leaders, Spotted Tail, Red Cloud, American Horse, young men afraid of his horses. He told them, "Send your children to my school. I will educate them. They will learn English, trades, how to succeed in the white man's world. This is their only hope for survival." Some leaders agreed reluctantly. They saw the writing on the wall. White Americans were not going away. Perhaps education would help their children navigate this new world. Some leaders sent their own children to show their people it was safe. Other leaders refused. They saw this for what it was, taking children away, destroying their culture. But refusal often wasn't an option. The government had leverage. Withhold rations, withhold treaty payments, threaten imprisonment. In the end, 82 children from Rosebud and Pine Ridge were selected to go to Carlisle. Among them, an 11-year-old Lakota boy named Ota Kete, which means plenty kill. He would become Luther Standing Bear. Luther Standing Bear. The journey east, 1320, 1,600 words. Narrator. Luther Standing Bear later wrote 2 books about his experiences. My People, the Sioux, and Land of the Spotted Eagle. These are first-hand accounts written by someone who was there, who lived it. Here's what he remembered about leaving home in 1879, at age 11. The selection. Luther's father was Standing Bear, a hereditary chief of the Lakota. When Captain Pratt came recruiting, Standing Bear told his son, "Son, you are young. You can learn the ways of the white man. It will be good for our people if you go. You will learn their language and their skills. Then you can help our people." Luther agreed. He wanted to make his father proud, but he was also terrified. He later wrote, "We had heard stories of what happened to our people when they were taken far away. Some never came back. We wondered if we would die in the white man's land." The journey. October 1879. 82 children boarded a train in South Dakota, bound for Pennsylvania. Most had never seen a train before. Luther described it as the moving house that breathed fire and smoke. The journey took several days. The children sat crowded in train cars, watching their homeland disappear behind them. Luther wrote, "We saw the land grow different. The Great Plains became hills, then mountains, then strange green lands with many trees. Everything was unfamiliar. We were leaving our world behind. Some children cried. Others sat silent. All were frightened." Arrival at Carlisle, November 1879. When they arrived, the children were marched into the school. Waiting for them, Captain Pratt and his staff. The first order: choose English names. Luther Standing Bear described this moment. They took us into a room. On the wall was a blackboard covered with strange symbols, the white man's writing. We did not know what they meant. Captain Pratt said we must choose names from this board. These would be our names now. I did not understand any of the symbols, so I simply pointed at one. That symbol was Luther. So I became Luther. They gave me my father's name, Standing Bear, as my second name, which they called a surname. I did not know what my new name meant. It had no meaning to me, but it was mine now, whether I understood it or not. The next step: haircuts. In Lakota culture, cutting hair was done only in mourning. Long hair represented strength, honor, connection to the spiritual world. For a boy to have his hair cut meant someone close to him had died. But the school didn't care about Lakota culture. Luther wrote, "They took us to the barber. One by one, our long hair was cut short. When it was my turn, I felt the scissors cutting. I watched my hair that had grown since I was born, fall to the ground. Some of the boys cried when their hair was cut. I did not cry, but inside, I felt something die. It felt like mourning, because something was dying. The Indian in us. That's what they wanted to kill. The uniforms." Luther described, "They gave us the clothes of white men. Hide collars that were stiff and uncomfortable. Shirts with buttons we did not know how to fasten. Suspenders 3 inches wide that pulled on our shoulders. Shoes that hurt our feet. We were used to wearing moccasins and blankets. Now we wore clothes that made us look like small white soldiers. They said these clothes would make us civilized, but to us, they just made us uncomfortable and strange to ourselves." The rules. From day one, the rules were clear and strictly enforced. 1. No speaking native languages. Only English. 2. No native dress. Only uniforms. 3. No native customs. Only white American ways. 4. Mandatory church attendance. Christianity only. 5. Military-style discipline, marching, drills, obedience. Punishment for breaking rules. Beatings with straps or switches. Confinement in dark closets. Withholding food. Public humiliation. Solitary isolation. Learning English. Luther was one of the first students. In 1879, there was no one at Carlisle who spoke Lakota to translate. He had to learn English by immersion, sink or swim. He wrote, "They would point at things and say words. We had to repeat. Chair, table, book, pen. If we mispronounced, they corrected us sharply. If we spoke Lakota even by accident, we were punished. Some children learned quickly, Others struggled for months, and some never fully learned English, but they were punished anyway. The classroom. Luther described the education. They taught us to read and write English, to do arithmetic, to learn about white man's history, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, the American Revolution. They taught us that America was the greatest nation on earth, that white civilization was superior to all others. They taught us that our own people were savages who needed to be civilized. They taught us to be ashamed of being Indian. The work. Carlisle wasn't just a school, it was also a labor camp. Students spent half the day in class, half the day working. Boys learned trades: carpentry, blacksmithing, farming, printing. Girls learned domestic work: cooking, sewing, laundry, cleaning. The school saved money by having students do all the labor: cooking meals, cleaning buildings, growing food, making furniture. Luther learned to be a tinsmith. He also worked in the school's print shop. The idea was train them for manual labor jobs in white society, not professional careers, manual labor. The loneliness. Luther wrote, "At night, lying in the dormitory with dozens of other boys, I thought of home. I thought of my father, my mother, my sisters, the plains, the buffalo hunts, the ceremonies, everything I had known for the first 11 years of my life. All of that was gone now. I was in a strange land, wearing strange clothes, speaking a strange language, learning strange ways. And I knew I might never see home again. Many children who came to Carlisle never returned. The deaths begin. Within months of Carlisle opening, children started dying. The first burials. January 1880, 2 students died and were buried on school grounds. December 1880, Maud Little Girl and Ernest Knoxoff died on the same day. Luther, standing bare, watched his classmates die. He wrote, "Some died of sickness, coughing that would not stop, fevers that burned them away, the white man's diseases that our bodies could not fight. Some died of sadness. They could not bear being so far from home. They stopped eating, stopped trying, and they faded away. Some died from punishment, beaten so badly they never recovered. Every few weeks, we would hear that another student had died. We would attend their burial, watch them be put in the ground, far from their people." Carlisle was the model, the blueprint. By 1900, just 21 years after Carlisle opened, the United States was operating dozens of Indian boarding schools. The system expanded rapidly. 1880s, 60 schools operating. 1890s, 150 schools operating. 1900s, 250 schools operating. By 1925, 367 federal Indian boarding schools across 29 states, plus hundreds more run by Christian churches: Catholic, Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist. In Canada, the residential school system followed the same model. 1,883 first government-funded residential schools opened. By 1930s, 80 schools operating across Canada. Total, by 1,996, 139 documented residential schools. The schools were everywhere. In the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, in the Great Plains, South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming. In the Northwest, Washington, Oregon, Idaho. In California, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan. In Alaska, where native children were taken from islands and villages accessible only by boat. In Canada, British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, every province with Indigenous populations. Each school held between 100 and 500 students. Do the math. 367 schools in the U.S. times average 200 students equals 73,400 children in schools at any given time. Over 118 years, 1860 to 1978, with new students entering every year as older students left or died, equals conservative estimate 150,000 to 200,000 Native American children passed through U.S. boarding schools. In Canada, 150,000 children documented in residential schools between 1883 to 1997. Combined, over 300,000 children in North America. How did schools get these children? 3 methods. Method 1. Coercion. Indian agents, government officials assigned to reservations, would tell parents, "Send your children to school, or we will withhold your rations. Send your children to school, or we will cut off your treaty payments. Send your children to school, or we will arrest you. Parents on reservations depended on government rations to survive. The buffalo were gone. Traditional hunting grounds were gone. They lived on government land, receiving government food. If the government threatened to withhold food, families would starve. So parents, desperate and powerless, handed over their children. Method 2. Force. Indian agents, backed by police or soldiers, would simply take children. A survivor from the Blackfeet Nation recalled, "The agent came to our camp with soldiers. He pointed at children. The soldiers grabbed them. Mothers screamed. Fathers tried to stop them. One father was hit with a rifle. The children were thrown into wagons and driven away. Some mothers ran after the wagons for miles until they collapsed." This happened on multiple reservations across the U.S. and Canada. Government records from the era acknowledge this. A 1,920 U.S. government report stated, "Indian parents are often reluctant to send their children to boarding schools. It is sometimes necessary for agents to use force to secure attendance." Use force to secure attendance. That's government language for kidnapping. Method 3. Manipulation of children. Some schools sent recruiters directly to reservations. These recruiters would promise children exciting adventures in faraway places, show pictures of school buildings, uniforms, activities, tell children they'd learn to read, write, have warm beds, and 3 meals a day. Target children who are poor, orphaned, or struggling. Young children, ages 5, 6, 7, didn't understand they were being taken away permanently. They thought it was a temporary trip, a school visit, an adventure. By the time they realized the truth, they were hundreds of miles from home with no way back. One survivor recalled, "I was 6 years old. A man came to our reservation and showed us pictures of a big school with nice buildings. He said we would learn wonderful things. I wanted to go. I begged my mother to let me go. She didn't want to send me, but the agent said if she didn't, our family would lose our rations. So she let me go. I didn't know I wouldn't see her again for 7 years. If I had known, I would have screamed and fought. But I was 6. I didn't understand. What happened when children arrived at schools? The process was the same at almost every school. Step 1. Renaming. Children were given English names, often random names from lists. Sometimes they chose their own names from lists they couldn't read. Sometimes staff just assigned names. Sometimes children were given numbers instead of names. One survivor remembered, "They called me number 109. That was my name for 2 years. I forgot my real name. When I finally went home, my grandmother asked my name. I said, 109. She wept." Step 2. Haircuts. For boys, long hair cut short in military style. For girls, long braids cut off. This was traumatic across nearly all native cultures. Long hair represented connection to ancestors, spiritual strength, cultural identity. For many tribes, hair was only cut in mourning. Cutting children's hair was cutting their identity. One survivor described, "When they cut my braids, I felt my strength leave my body. My grandmother had braided my hair every morning since I was small. Now my braids were on the floor, thrown away like garbage. I picked up one braid and tried to keep it. They took it from me and threw it in the trash." Step 3. Uniforms. Boys, military-style uniforms, stiff collars, dark jackets, caps. Girls, identical plain dresses, often grey or brown. Personal clothing from home was confiscated. Children were not allowed to keep anything from their tribes. No moccasins, no traditional jewelry, no medicine bundles, no items from parents. Everything that connected them to their culture was taken away. Step 4. Language suppression. This was the most brutal assault on identity. The rule, enforced at virtually every school: speak only English. Any native language is forbidden, but many children, especially younger ones, arrived knowing no English. They couldn't ask for food, couldn't ask for the bathroom, couldn't tell staff they were sick or hurt. They could only speak in their native tongue, and when they did, they were punished. Punishment and abuse. 28 to 0, 35 to 0 to 1,000, 550 words. Narrator. The punishments for speaking native languages varied by school and era, but survivor testimonies reveal consistent patterns across hundreds of schools and decades. Punishment method 1. Beatings. Straps, switches, rulers, belts, fists. A Navajo survivor testified, "I was 7 years old. I spoke Navajo to my sister because I didn't know how to say what I needed in English. A teacher heard me. She grabbed me by the ear and dragged me to the front of the class. She made me bend over. She hit me with a leather strap, 10 times, in front of all the other students. I was 7 years old, and I didn't understand why speaking my mother's language was a crime. A Cree survivor from Canada testified. If we spoke Cree, they would beat our hands with a ruler, the metal kind. They would hit our knuckles until our hands swelled and bled. Some children had broken fingers from the beatings, but they kept speaking Cree anyway because it was the only language they knew. Punishment method 2, mouthwashing, lye soap, caustic soap, soap so harsh it burned. A survivor testified. When I spoke my language, they shoved soap in my mouth. Not regular soap, harsh soap that burned my tongue and throat. They made me stand with the soap in my mouth for an hour. I couldn't swallow. I drooled. I gagged. Other children had to watch. As a warning, another survivor, a girl in my class, spoke her language. They put lye soap in her mouth and made her hold it there. She vomited. They punished her for vomiting. She was 8 years old. Punishment method 3, isolation, dark closets, basements, cells. A survivor testified. They had a closet they called the prison. It was completely dark, no windows, no light. If you spoke your language, they locked you in for hours, sometimes overnight. I was locked in that closet when I was 9. I was terrified of the dark. I screamed and screamed. No one came. Punishment method 4, food deprivation, missing meals, reduced rations, starvation. A survivor testified. If you spoke your language at breakfast, you didn't get lunch. If you spoke it at lunch, you didn't get dinner. Some children went days with almost no food because they couldn't stop speaking the only language they knew. Punishment method 5, public humiliation, forced to wear signs, forced to stand in front of the school, shamed in front of peers. A survivor remembered. They made me wear a sign around my neck that said, "I will not speak Indian." I had to wear it all day. Other students laughed at me. Teachers pointed at me as an example. I was humiliated. But I didn't even know what the sign said, because I couldn't read English yet. Beyond language punishment, there was routine abuse, physical abuse, beatings for minor infractions, speaking out of turn, looking at a teacher wrong, moving too slowly, excessive corporal punishment, hitting children until they bled, forcing children to do hard labor, digging ditches, hauling coal, working in fields for hours, emotional abuse, constant degradation, you're stupid, you're savage, you're worthless, forcing children to denounce their families and cultures, telling children their parents were evil, their traditions were devil worship, sexual abuse. This is the darkest part, and it was widespread. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada documented thousands of cases of sexual abuse at residential schools. In the U.S., lawsuits and survivor testimonies reveal the same pattern. Priests, teachers, staff members, people in positions of absolute power over vulnerable children, sexually abused students. Some examples documented in legal settlements. A priest at a school in Montana abused dozens of boys over 20 years. A teacher at a school in Oklahoma abused girls as young as 7. Staff at multiple schools in Canada operated abuse rings, passing children between abusers, and when children tried to tell someone, they were punished for lying. They were beaten for making accusations. They were isolated for being troublemakers. A survivor testified. A priest abused me when I was 11. I tried to tell a nun. She slapped me and called me a liar. She said, "How dare you accuse a man of God? You will go to hell for this lie." Then she locked me in a closet for 2 days. The abuse was not isolated to a few bad schools. It was systemic. A 2022 U.S. Department of Interior investigation found evidence of abuse at schools across the entire system. The Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission concluded that abuse was rampant and widespread. Children had no protection, no one to turn to, no way to escape, because everyone at the school was part of the system. Death at the schools, 35 to 0, 43 to 0 to 1,700 words. Narrator. Children died at these schools at rates far higher than in the general population. Why? 5 main causes. Cause 1. Disease. Tuberculosis was the biggest killer. TB spreads in crowded, poorly ventilated spaces. It thrives where people are malnourished and stressed. Boarding schools were perfect breeding grounds. Children slept in overcrowded dormitories, 50 to 100 students in one room. Ventilation was poor. Children were malnourished. Medical care was minimal or non-existent. A 1,914 government report on tuberculosis in Indian boarding schools stated, "The death rate from tuberculosis among Indian school children is approximately 10 times higher than among white children. This is due to overcrowding, poor ventilation, inadequate nutrition, and lack of medical care. The government KNEW children were dying at 10 times the normal rate, and the schools stayed open." Other diseases that killed children. Measles in communities with no previous exposure. Measles was deadly. Influenza, especially the 1918 flu pandemic, which devastated schools. Pneumonia, children weakened by malnutrition succumbed easily. Smallpox, mumps, whooping cough, scarlet fever. At many schools, when disease broke out, children were not quarantined properly. Sick children stayed in dormitories with healthy children. The disease spread. More children got sick, more died. Cause 2. Malnutrition. Schools were chronically underfunded. The government allocated minimal money per student, barely enough to feed them. But many schools spent even less than allocated, pocketing the difference. Students were fed watery soup, stale bread, moldy potatoes, rotten meat, minimal vegetables or fruit. A survivor testified, "We were hungry all the time. The food was terrible. Bread with mold, soup that was mostly water, meat that smelled bad. We were growing children. We were hungry, but they gave us barely enough to survive." Malnutrition weakened children's immune systems. When disease came, malnourished children died. Cause 3. Accidents and unsafe conditions. Schools forced children to do dangerous work, operating heavy machinery without training, working in extreme temperatures, coal furnaces in winter, fields in summer heat, working on roofs, in basements, around dangerous equipment. Children died from falls from roofs or scaffolding, burns from furnaces, machinery accidents, drownings. Some schools were near rivers. Children drowned during work or recreation. Freezing children who ran away in winter, sometimes froze to death. A 1928 government report noted, "Indian school children are frequently assigned work beyond their physical capacity and in conditions that pose serious safety risks." Cause 4. Medical neglect. Many schools had no doctors, no nurses, no medical care whatsoever. When children got sick, they were told to work through it, given no medicine, isolated in infirmaries with no treatment, sent to bed with no diagnosis. Sometimes children died of easily treatable conditions because there was no one to treat them. A documented case. Dennis Strikes First, Rosebud Sioux, died the 19th of January, 1887, at Carlisle. Cause of death: pneumonia. He arrived at Carlisle the 6th of October, 1879, healthy and strong. By January 1887, he was dead. The school newspaper described him as a bright, studious, ambitious boy standing first in his class. He was 15 or 16 years old. Pneumonia is treatable even in 1887 with proper medical care and rest. But at Carlisle, there was minimal medical care. Dennis died, far from home, far from family. He's buried in the Carlisle Cemetery, grave #height 3. Cause 5. Suicide and despair. This is perhaps the most heartbreaking. Children as young as 8, 9, 10 years old took their own lives. Why? Because they were so far from home, so isolated, so abused, so hopeless, that death seemed like the only escape. Documented cases. A 1920s report from a school in Oklahoma noted, a 9-year-old boy attempted to hang himself in the dormitory. He was discovered and cut down. When asked why, he said he wanted to go home, and this was the only way. A survivor testified, "A girl in my dormitory tried to kill herself. She was 11. She had been at the school for 2 years. She missed her mother so much she couldn't bear it anymore. They found her before she died. They punished her for trying. Some children didn't attempt suicide, they simply gave up. Stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped trying, and they faded away." Staff called it going back to the blankets, meaning the child was reverting to savage ways. But really, the child was dying of despair. What happened when children died? Protocol varied by school and era, but a common pattern. Step 1. Record the death in school logs. Step 2. Notify the government's Indian agent. Step 3. Sometimes notify the family, sometimes not. Step 4. Bury the child on school grounds. Bodies were not returned to families. Why not? Official reason: too expensive to transport bodies hundreds of miles. Real reason: schools wanted to hide the death toll. Returning dozens of bodies to reservations would reveal how many children were dying. Families often didn't learn their child had died for weeks or months. Sometimes they never learned the cause of death. Sometimes they never learned where their child was buried. A mother's testimony from the 1930s. My son was taken to boarding school when he was 8. I received a letter 3 months later saying he had died of influenza. They didn't send his body home. They said it was too far. They buried him at the school. I never got to see him again. I never got to say goodbye. I don't know where his grave is. For 40 years, I didn't know where my son was buried. The cemeteries. Every boarding school had a cemetery. At Carlisle, 186 known graves, plus an unknown number of unmarked graves. At other schools, dozens to hundreds of graves each. Some graves had headstones with names. Many were marked only unknown. Many had no markers at all. In 1927, the Carlisle cemetery was moved to make room for new construction. During the move, some remains went missing. Graves were lost track of. The exact number of children buried there is still uncertain. Luther Standing Bear wrote about the Carlisle cemetery. We saw the cemetery grow. Every few weeks, another student died, another burial. We would attend the funeral, watch the coffin lowered into the ground, sing hymns in English that we barely understood. And we would think, will I be next? Will I die here too, far from the sacred Black Hills where my ancestors are buried? That cemetery was a constant reminder. Many of us would never go home. The ones who survived, 43 to 0, 50 to 0 to 1,500 words. Narrator. Not all children died. Some survived, some even graduated. But survival came at a cost. Luther Standing Bear survived Carlisle. He attended from 1879 to 1884, 5 years. He learned to read and write English fluently, mathematics, history, geography, a trade, tinsmithing, to dress, speak, and act like a white American. By 1884, he was considered one of Carlisle's success stories. Captain Pratt held him up as proof the system worked. See, we can transform Indians into civilized Americans. But what did success cost Luther? He wrote about this years later. I learned English. I learned white man's ways. I learned to look like them, dress like them, work like them. But I also learned to be ashamed of being Lakota. For years after Carlisle, I didn't want to speak Lakota. I didn't want to wear traditional clothing. I didn't want to participate in ceremonies. I had been taught that those things were savage, evil, backwards. It took me decades to unlearn that shame, to reclaim my identity, to be proud of being Lakota again. This was the reality for many successful students. They learned English and trades, but they also learned to hate themselves. They were caught between two worlds, too Indian for white society, which still saw them as inferior, no matter how civilized they became, too white for their tribes, which saw them as changed, disconnected, lost. They didn't fully belong anywhere. What happened to students who returned to reservations? Many struggled. Problem 1. They'd forgotten their native languages, or been forbidden to speak them for so long they'd lost fluency. They couldn't communicate fully with elders. Problem 2. They'd missed crucial cultural education ceremonies, traditions, skills passed down through families. They'd been gone during the years they should have been learning these things. Problem 3. Their communities had changed. Years had passed. People had moved. Traditions had evolved. They didn't fit in anymore. Problem 4. The skills they learned were useless. Reservations had no jobs for blacksmiths, tinsmiths, or laundresses trained in white domestic service. A survivor testified, I spent 8 years at boarding school. When I came home, I was 18. My grandmother spoke to me in our language. I couldn't understand her anymore. She cried. She said, they took my granddaughter and sent back a stranger. She was right. I was a stranger. In my own home. Another survivor. They taught me to be a carpenter at school. I learned to build furniture, cabinets, houses. When I returned to the reservation, there was no work. No one needed carpenters. There was no money to build anything. All those years learning a trade I couldn't use. Some students refused to return to reservations. They stayed in white society, working low-wage jobs in cities, trying to pass as white, if their appearance allowed, marrying white spouses, cutting ties with their families and tribes. They chose assimilation because it seemed like the only path to survival, but it meant abandoning their identity, their culture, their people. Luther Standing Bear's path. After Carlisle, he worked briefly on a reservation school. Then he joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, performing as a wild Indian for white audiences. The irony, he'd been sent to Carlisle to be civilized. Now he was performing Savage Indian for entertainment. Later, he moved to California, worked in films, wrote books. In his books, he criticized the boarding school system. They took children from their families and tried to make them into white people. But we could never be white. We could only become broken versions of ourselves, not fully Indian, not fully American, not fully anything. The system didn't kill the Indian and save the man. It killed the Indian and broke the man. The intergenerational trauma. The damage didn't stop with the students who attended. It passed to their children, and their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren. How? Survivors of boarding schools often struggled with alcoholism and substance abuse, coping mechanisms for trauma, struggled with depression, PTSD, anxiety, had difficulty forming healthy relationships. Having been separated from families at young ages, they never learned healthy family dynamics. Had difficulty parenting, having been raised in institutions, not families. They didn't have parenting models. Past trauma responses to their children. A survivor's daughter testified, "My father attended boarding school from age 6 to 16. He never talked about it, but he was angry all the time. He drank. He couldn't show affection. As a child, I didn't understand why. I thought he didn't love me. It wasn't until I was an adult that I learned what happened to him at that school. The beatings, the abuse, the years away from his family. He wasn't angry at me. He was angry at what was done to him. But I suffered the consequences of his trauma anyway. This is called historical trauma or intergenerational trauma. The term was created by Dr. Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart, a Lakota social worker, to describe how trauma is passed through generations. The trauma of boarding schools still affects Native communities today, in the form of higher rates of substance abuse, higher rates of suicide, higher rates of domestic violence, disrupted family structures, loss of language and culture. The schools closed decades ago, but the damage continues. The truth emerges. 2008 to 2025, 50 to 0, 55 to 0 to 1,300 words. Narrator. For most of the 20th century, the full truth about residential schools was hidden. Schools kept minimal records of deaths. Governments didn't investigate. Churches covered up abuse. Survivors were ignored or dismissed. But in the 21st century, the truth began to emerge. 2008. Canada forms the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. TRC. Purpose. Investigate the residential school system. Collect survivor testimonies. Document what happened. The commission collected testimonies from over 6,750 survivors, documents from government and church archives, records of deaths, abuses, policies. 2015. The TRC releases its final report. Key findings. 150,000 children attended residential schools, 1883 to 1997. 4,120 confirmed deaths documented. Actual death toll, likely 6,000 to 25,000. Widespread physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. Cultural genocide occurred. The report concluded, the Canadian government, through the residential school system, pursued a policy of cultural genocide against Indigenous peoples. 2021. The discovery at Kamloops. May 27, 2021. Using ground-penetrating radar, investigators detected 215 unmarked graves at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia. All children, some as young as 3 years old. The news made international headlines. What followed? June 2021. 751. Unmarked graves found at Marieville Indian Residential School, Saskatchewan. July 2021. 182. Unmarked graves found at Street Eugene's Mission School, British Columbia, 2021 to 2025. Over 1,300 total unmarked graves found at multiple schools across Canada. The U.S. Investigation, 2021, U.S. Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland, first Native American cabinet member, granddaughter of people forced into boarding schools, announces investigation into U.S. boarding school system. May 2022, Department of Interior releases initial report. Findings. 367 federal Indian boarding schools operated 1819 to 1969. At least 500 confirmed deaths documented. At least 53 burial sites identified. True death toll likely much higher. Evidence of widespread abuse. The report states, the federal Indian boarding school system It was created to eliminate Indigenous identities, languages, and cultures as part of a broader strategy of territorial dispossession. 2022 to 2025. Ongoing investigations. Tribes across the U.S. begin using ground-penetrating radar to search former school sites. Dozens of potential burial sites identified. Exhumations begin at some schools. Carlisle has repatriated remains of 30-plus children to families since 2017. Other schools beginning similar processes. Why weren't these graves known before? Several reasons. 1. Schools didn't keep accurate records or deliberately minimized death counts. 2. Graves weren't properly marked. Many had wooden markers that rotted over time. 3. Cemeteries were moved or paved over when schools closed or land was redeveloped. 4. No one was looking for decades. Governments and churches denied the scale of deaths. 5. Families couldn't afford to search. Many families lived in poverty. Traveling hundreds of miles to search for unmarked graves was impossible. The truth was always there, in survivor testimonies, in oral histories. But it took modern technology, ground-penetrating radar, and a willingness to listen to survivors before the physical evidence was uncovered. The apologies. Canada, 2008. Prime Minister Stephen Harper formally apologized for residential schools. United States, 2009. President Obama signed an apology, buried in a defense spending bill, with minimal publicity. Catholic Church, 2022. Pope Francis visited Canada and apologized for the church's role in residential schools. But apologies don't bring back the dead. Apologies don't undo 118 years of cultural genocide. Apologies don't heal the intergenerational trauma that continues today. What survivors say they need. 1. Full disclosure, all records released, all burial sites searched. 2. Repatriation remains, return to families for proper burial. 3. Justice prosecution of abusers, where possible. 4. Reparations, financial compensation for survivors and descendants. 5. Education, the full truth taught in schools. 6. Support for healing mental health services, cultural revitalization programs. 7. Remembrance memorials, museums, permanent acknowledgement. Some of this is happening, slowly. But for many survivors now in their 70 seconds, 80 seconds, 90 seconds, it's too late. They lived their entire lives waiting for acknowledgement that what was done to them was wrong. Many died before that acknowledgement came. Conclusion: 55 to 0, 60 to 0 to 1,100 words. Narrator. Let's return to where we started. The 14th of December, 1880. Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Maud Little Girl and Ernest Knoxoff died that day. Both 10 years old, both Rosebud Sioux, both far from home. Their fathers, Swift Bear and White Thunder, learned on the same day that their children had died 1,600 miles away. What do you think those fathers felt? Grief, rage, helplessness. They had been told to send their children to school, told it would be good for them, told they would be educated, cared for, returned home. Instead, their children died in a strange land and were buried in unmarked graves. Maud and Ernest are just two names among thousands. But knowing their names, knowing they were real children, with real families who loved them, makes this more than statistics. These weren't numbers, they were people. Maud Little Girl was described as bright, impulsive, warm-hearted, much loved by her schoolmates. Ernest Knoxoff was bright, studious, ambitious, standing first in his class. They had personalities, dreams, futures, all taken away. The question we must ask is, how did this happen? How did two nations, the United States and Canada, run systems that forcibly took over 300,000 children from their families for over a century? How did governments, churches, and ordinary citizens participate in or ignore cultural genocide? The answer is, they believed they were right. They believed native cultures were inferior. They believed assimilation was progress. They believed they were saving children from savage lives. Racism disguised as charity, genocide disguised as education. And when children died by the thousands, they told themselves it was unavoidable. Disease, accidents, the price of progress. They buried the bodies and moved on. But the bodies didn't stay buried. The truth didn't stay hidden. In 2021, ground-penetrating radar found those 215 graves at Kamloops, and the world finally paid attention. The residential school system officially ended. United States, 19781. 38 years after it began. Canada, 199711, 4 years after it began. But the damage continues. Native communities today still suffer from loss of language. Hundreds of Indigenous languages are extinct or endangered. Loss of cultural practices, ceremonies, traditions, interrupted for generations. Intergenerational trauma, passed down through families. Health disparities, higher rates of addiction, mental illness, suicide. Economic disparities, poverty, unemployment. These are the long-term effects of trying to kill the Indian. What should we do with this history? First, remember it. Don't look away. Don't minimize it. Don't say, that was a long time ago. For many survivors, it wasn't a long time ago. They're still alive, still suffering. Second, learn the truth. This history should be taught in schools. Children should learn what their governments did. Third, support healing. Listen to survivors. Support cultural revitalization. Support mental health services for Native communities. Fourth, demand accountability. All records should be released. All burial sites should be searched. All remains should be repatriated. This is not just Native American history. This is American history, Canadian history, our collective history. We cannot change the past, but we can acknowledge it, learn from it, do better. In closing, I want to share the words of a survivor. This testimony was given to Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I was taken from my mother when I was 6 years old. I didn't see her again for 8 years. When I came home, I couldn't speak my language anymore, my mother cried. I'm 75 years old now. My mother died 30 years ago. I never got to tell her I was sorry. Sorry I forgot our language. Sorry I forgot our ways. Sorry I came home changed. That's what the schools did. They didn't just take us from our families. They made us strangers to our own families when we finally came home. 150,000 Native American children taken from their families in the United States. 150,000 First Nations children taken in Canada. Thousands died. Thousands buried in unmarked graves. Thousands never came home. This is what kill the Indian, save the man really meant. This is the truth of the residential school system. Remember Maud, little girl. Remember Ernest Knox-Off. Remember the 186 children buried at Carlisle. Remember the 1,300 plus children found at Canadian schools. Remember the thousands whose graves we haven't found yet. Remember their names. Remember their stories. Remember what was done to them. Because if we forget, we allow it to happen again. This is documented history. This is truth. And the truth must be told.